Hey everyone, I'm here again with another video. Now I know a lot of you might be thinking, Zoob, why the random video? It's not even Wednesday. Well, that's because I've seen a lot of people, especially other YouTubers, say that Xiao is busted as hell. But is he really? We have to remember that these other YouTubers are not really free to play, with the exception of Enviosity, who doesn't use Xiao anyways. I never liked those videos that showcase 5-star characters. I mean, I enjoyed them for their less technical aspects, showing their playstyle, fluidity, and overall aesthetic of the character. However, I would never trust these people for how good the unit is in combat. Typically, these YouTubers have already pre-farmed pretty much everything needed for that character. They already have a level 90 weapon with a plus 20 artifact set, and just enough character XP books to hit level 90. So they're not really representative of the majority free-to-play base, and no one should take their word when they say that any character is really good or really bad, because they're comparing them at C6 with max stats. So that's what I aim to do. I want to see how well Xiao can be for free-to-play, and if you should even roll for him. The first step is, of course, the assumptions and notes. Assumption 1, Xiao is going to be level 70, Ascension 4, Constellation 0. If you want to go all in, you can go to level 80, Ascension 6, but that's incredibly expensive, especially with the gemstones needed. When you're at level 70 with Ascension 4, you do gain access to all the passives, so all the kit-defining mechanics are in place now. Assumption 2, Xiao's weapons are going to be level 70, Ascension 4. There's not much reason for this other than to keep it in line with the character level. You could, again, get this up to level 90, Ascension 6, but this is also expensive. Not as expensive as characters getting to that point, but it's still relatively expensive, and level 70 is a pretty good base metric. Assumption 3, Xiao's talents are all going to be level 6 because boss drops are incredibly frustrating to get, and many characters share the same boss talent material, so I don't know which one Xiao's using, I don't remember anymore, but there's a chance that you use boss talent materials for another character, and if you don't get it, you don't get it sometimes. So we're going to assume level 6 because this is the base talent level that everyone can get to without having to get any boss talent materials. Assumption 4, I will be assuming that he is using his burst off cooldown. I know this is impossible, alright, and I will elaborate later in the video about this. Assumption 5, he will be going against our 4 formations, the cluster, lone, boss, and flank formations as usual. That's it for now, so let's get to the math. Taking a look at Xiao's normal attacks, Whirlwind Thrust, we get these values. As you can see, I'm taking these values from Honey Impact because the wiki doesn't have all the values yet, but the ones that are there seem to agree with Honey Impact. At talent level 6, Xiao's entire combo deals 582.34%, or what I measure to be about 3.9 seconds, which is also equivalent to about 234 frames. But that's not all. When his burst is active, Xiao gains the ability to jump and use his plunge attack anywhere he wants without having to climb up to higher ground, so let's take a look at that too. The values for plunge attacks can be weird. As you can see here, there are actually 3 values: plunge damage, low plunge damage, and high plunge damage. But what does it all mean? It's actually pretty simple, if miHoYo ever explained it, but they don't, so I'll do that for them. Plunge damage is damage dealt by the character when they physically impact an enemy. It's that small damage that occurs when your character sprite impacts the enemy sprite. Low plunge damage is AoE physical damage dealt when you do a plunge attack from about shorter than Zhongli's pillar. High plunge damage is AoE physical damage dealt when you do a plunge attack from Zhongli pillar height or taller. Luckily, when Xiao uses his jump in burst form, he is capable of doing the high plunge damage of 297.07%. And from my measurements, it takes about 84 frames to jump and plunge attack. Keep in mind though that this attack is only really available when Xiao has his burst active. He can do a plunge attack if he jumps, uses his skill, but that can misposition you very easily, so there's not much reason to do that except against very specific enemies. But more on that later. Now onto his skill. Xiao's skill, Limited Static Wind Cycling, is a very quick attack that can store up to 2 charges with a 10-second cooldown. According to Honey Impact, Xiao's skill deals 353.92% damage at talent level 6. This is actually quite high, and not only that, it is an incredibly high movement ability that only takes about 48 frames, which means that this skill can be used in place of dodging in certain scenarios. Now, Xiao's passive 2, Dissolution Eon, Heaven Fall, also increases the damage of his skill by 15% for 7 seconds with a max of 3 stacks. This means that you may want to use one skill every 5 seconds in order to maintain the 45% damage buff on Xiao's skill. The only issue with this skill is that it only generates 3 Anemo particles per use, and 0 particles when his burst is active, so let's talk about that. Xiao's burst, Bane of All Evil, doesn't do any damage on its own. Instead, it converts all of Xiao's attacks to Anemo and grants a damage boost to his normal attack talent, which includes the normal attacks, charge attacks, and plunge attacks. At talent level 6, Xiao's burst grants his normal attack talent an additional 77% damage. This is quite significant, but it gets better. Xiao's passive 1, Conqueror of Evil, Tamer of Demons, increases all damage dealt by Xiao by 5% when his burst is active, increasing by an additional 5% every 3 seconds up to a maximum bonus of 25%. This effectively translates to an average 15% damage buff throughout Xiao's burst. Lastly, this burst requires 70 energy and takes around 84 frames, which is rather short for a burst, but the faster it goes, the longer time Xiao has to do plunge attacks. With all the values in place, it's time to build our formula. Using a 90-second standard, or 5400 frames, Xiao can use his skill a maximum of 10 times and his burst a maximum of 5 times. Taking the 5400 frames, we just subtract that 10 times 48 frames, 5 times 84 frames, as well as our dodge input of 23 frames per 300 frames to get a total of 4086 frames left for normal attacks. Now, if you don't know what the dodge input is, it's basically me saying that every 5 seconds, you have to dodge once. It's really used as an error margin, because chances are you're not going to be able to frame perfect every single attack here, and chances are you will have to dodge at least once or twice every, several hundred frames. It's impossible to tell depending on who you're fighting, but this is just as an error margin. Now, if you've watched my other DPS videos, then you're going to notice I'm doing something different here, and it's called literally ignore everything I just said. Not the dodge input thing, but the entire formula. See, what makes Xiao unique from the others is that he uses completely different attacks when in his burst form. His plunge attack does far more damage than his normal attacks do, so when in his burst, you literally want to spam that attack as often as possible. So, if we assume Xiao uses his burst off cooldown, this means that every 18 seconds, 15 of them are spent doing plunge attacks, while the other 3 are spent doing normal attacks. 15 seconds times 5 is 75 seconds, but of those 75 seconds, 1.4 times 5, or just 7 seconds, are used up by the burst activation. This in turn means that during Xiao's burst, he can perform about 48 plunge attacks in addition to the 10 skill uses. The plunge attack value is rounded down because I'm not going to assume that anyone can perfectly time it so that Xiao is already jumping by the end of the burst. Now, in order to generate the most energy as Xiao, you're also going to want to store all of his uses of his skill for when his burst comes down. With hit lag, it shouldn't be impossible for Xiao to almost always have both uses of his skill by the time his burst is over, but this does mean that his passive 2 doesn't work that well. So I only gave Xiao's skill a modest 7.5% damage boost because you don't want to use his skill during his burst period, because then you don't have the energy. Thus, totaled up, Xiao will deal 83,153.81 times P plus 10,900 times S damage. The P is just the number of enemies in the plunge attack AoE, and the S, is the amount of enemies that are in the skill AoE. Ultimately though, this does mean that Xiao with burst cast off cooldown will literally never use his normal attacks. This isn't the case, however. Again, Xiao cannot generate energy on his own while in his burst, and if he swaps out, he loses the burst form. Which means that there will be a period of time where Xiao has to use his normal attack rotation without the extra attack percent from his burst, and without the ability to do plunge attacks. So we go back to our 90-second standard, then change it to 5400 frames to better understand, and for when I can eventually get a stronger computer. With Xiao's normal attack rotation taking approximately 234 frames, as discussed earlier, if we subtract the 10 skill uses and dodge inputs, we end up with 4506 frames to play with. Divide this by the 234 frames of his normal attack, and we get about 19 attack rotations. Now we can just multiply this out. With 19 normal attack rotations and 10 skill uses, Xiao will be dealing 31,698.68 times N plus 10,139.49 times S. Again, the N represents the amount of enemies in the normal attack rotation, AoE, and the S is the skill enemy, AoE. Okay? With both active burst and inactive burst values all worked out, we can now plug them into our formations. Against the cluster formation, because of how wide some of Xiao's attacks are, I'm going to give him the benefit of having his normal attacks hit an average of 3 enemies in the formation. For his plunge, he hits all 5 enemies pretty easily. His skill can hit a maximum of 3 enemies because it's a straight dash. However, if I'm being honest, it's far more likely that he'll only hit 2 enemies with his skill if the enemies are even slightly more spread apart. but in enough enemies, he'll probably hit 3, maybe, but that's the whole point of the cluster formation. Therefore, when his burst is active, Xiao will deal 443,517.90 damage over 90 seconds, and when his burst is inactive, 125,514.51 damage over 90 seconds. This is a DPS of 4,927.98 and 1,394.61 respectively. Against the lone and boss formations, Xiao can only hit the one enemy with any one attack, so that simplifies things for me. This results in Xiao dealing 82,447.15 damage with an active burst and 41,838.17 damage with an inactive burst, which in turn results in 916.08 DPS and 464.87 DPS respectively. Finally, against the flank formation, with an active burst, Xiao can hit all enemies with his Plunge attack, but only one of them with his skill. With an inactive burst, Xiao's normal attacks will only hit one enemy because of how auto-targeting works. Thus, Xiao will deal 154,754.8 damage with an active burst and 41,838.17 damage with an inactive burst, resulting in 1,719.5 DPS and 464.87 DPS, again, respectively. For reference, Ganyu deals 877.53 DPS against the lone formation. So technically, a Xiao using his burst off cooldown, which is only basically achievable in co-op, will be able to outdamage Ganyu against one enemy as long as weapons and artifacts aren't accounted for. But that's the problem. You will want to use artifacts, and once we include artifacts, Ganyu will massively outdamage Xiao because she has an artifact set that is pretty much her artifact set, much like how Crimson Witch is pretty much Diluc's artifact set. So for my conclusion, I'll say this. If you're looking for a DPS unit, then Xiao isn't a bad pick. He's certainly not the best pick, but he's not going to be bad. The problems with him are his huge energy requirements and incredibly selfish burst, which, when you have them up, may come incredibly powerful, but he's also very unlikely to maintain such a high uptime for it in solo play. I'd say a best case scenario is about 70 to 80% uptime, which results in an average of about 825.847 DPS against the lone formation, which is much lower than Ganyu, who needs no such setup at all. But enough of that, let's move on to the rest of the video. What's the best build and team for Xiao? Before we get started, there's going to be a divide here. Whales and non-whales. So I'm going to separate this into two parts as well. One build for the whales and one for the non-whales. However, all are equal in the eyes of artifacts, so let's start with that first. Unlike Ganyu, Diluc, and Tartaglia, Xiao doesn't get his own tailor-made artifact set, so he's going to have to settle for some Frankenstein set. As an Anemo character, there isn't much option for him, so basically the best artifact set for Xiao is probably going to be a 2/2 Viridescent Gladiator set. See, the biggest problem with Xiao, at least in terms of artifacts, is that he relies so heavily on Plunge attacks, but there are no artifact sets that complement that playstyle. Also, Anemo doesn't have a damage dealing set for them, when even Geo technically has Retracing Ballade as a potential DPS set. So he's stuck with the typical 2/2 Elemental Gladiator set for the plus 15% Anemo damage and plus 18% attack. The next part of any build is the weapon, and this is where the whales will separate from the non-whales. So I'm going to start with the whales first. For this group, we're going to ignore any polearm that's not 5-star. That's only because the 5-stars have higher base attack, so you should be using a 5-star polearm. Now, of the 3 5-star polearms that exist, you're going to want to use Primordial Jadewing Spear. Surprise, surprise, Xiao's signature polearm is his best in slot. Who could have guessed, right? Now, the reason you want to use this over something like Skyward Spine is because A, Primordial Jadewing Spear gives so many more stats, and B, Skyward Spine is targeted towards normal attack users. If you're using Skyward Spine, it grants a 12% normal attack speed boost. The problem is, Xiao does not use his normal attack, not very often at least, and it's not the majority of his damage by any stretch of the imagination. So you'd rather use the Primordial Jadewing Spear because it just grants 34.4% attack by hitting enemies, and it also has crit rate as its secondary stat. So the amount of stats that Primordial Jadewing Spear is just overall better than anything Skyward Spine can give. Now, if you do have Vortex Vanquisher, that can rival Primordial Jadewing Spear if you have Zhongli. If not, don't use Vortex Vanquisher because you're not going to have the 100% shield uptime. Now for the non-whales, also known as the 4-star weapons only. There's not a really good option here. The problem is that Xiao converts all damage to Anemo during his burst. Now typically this is a good thing because your Goblet now will boost the damage of your normal attacks. However, none of the craftable spears actually complement such a kit in any meaningful way. If you don't have any other 4-star weapons, if you don't have any other polearms though, I would recommend Prototype Star Glitter, only because of the energy recharge. The other 2 spears have physical damage on them, and they complement normal attack or charge attack focused spear wielders. If you don't use your normal attacks, you shouldn't be using something like the Dragon Spine Spear, because it only drops the Icicle if you're doing a normal attack. If you're going to use Crescent Pike, you better be generating energy particles constantly. But Xiao doesn't, because of how his burst works. So Crescent Pike is effectively just its base attack. You don't gain anything else from Crescent Pike. So Prototype Star Glitter becomes the best only by not being bad. Now if you're lucky, I'd aim for using Favonius Lance. If you get it to R5, Favonius Lance will be one of the best 4-star weapons for Xiao. With how energy hungry Xiao is, extra energy recharge is never bad, but the passive allows Xiao to regenerate energy while he's in his burst, so that's something that no other weapon allows, and Xiao always needs energy. Now, if a weapon comes out that can help Anemo users or infused elemental spear wielders, then that one will probably be much better than either Favonius or even Prototype Star Glitter, because it just increases damage. Or if one that directly increases Plunge attack, but I doubt that because Xiao already has Primordial Jade-Winged Spear, and they don't typically make 4-star spears as like a signature weapon. So until such a weapon comes out, your Favonius Lance or Prototype Star Glitter are going to be your best in slot for 4-star weapons, at least in my opinion. Now for team builds. This is the most variable part of the game because of how Abyss works, but let's work with the whale build first. Likely, you'd want Venti on Xiao's team. This is to generate energy, and also because Venti is overpowered. You also get that Anemo resonance, which is nice. You're also going to want a healer, since Xiao consumes 2.5% of his current HP. Honestly, it doesn't really matter who you use for this slot as long as they're a healer. Personally, I'd use this slot as the flex pick, since the 4 healers in the game are Cryo, Hydro, and Pyro, which can break pretty much every shield in the game. I'd actually opt for Chi-Chi if you had to choose, because she applies Cryo and there aren't many Hydro enemies in the game to freeze you. Also, her healing is tied to her skill and not her burst, which can solve some of the issue that some people have for stages like Abyss 11 in patch 1.3. Now, you can use Bennett, but since his healing is tied to his burst, that can get in the way of, again, Abyss 11. And also his attack buff, which is normally really good, isn't going to be utilized as much with Xiao's mobility. If Xiao uses his skill, he can easily dash out of Bennett's burst, and it just won't provide as much benefit as with many other characters. Finally, I'd go with Zhongli, mostly because his shield is just super powerful right now. Not only is it the only shield in the game that has a 100% uptime, it also grants the plus 20% elemental and physical resistance shred. So, if you use Zhongli, you're going to get the very rare Anemo shred. There's only, I think, 3 other characters that can grant Anemo shred, and I think it's like Venti, Jean with C2, and I think Traveler's Burst at some constellation level. I think these are the only characters that can grant Anemo shred. Veritas and Venerer doesn't work for Anemo or Geo, so any amount of resistance shred is going to be incredibly useful because it's going to stack for Xiao better than like a flat damage boost or a flat attack boost will ever do for him. But yeah, that would be my team if I had unlimited funding in every single character in the game. Now for the non-whales. First, you're going to need an Anemo battery, so I'd choose Sucrose. Ideally, you'd want C1 for that double charge skill, which can then chain into 3 usage skill with sacrificial fragments. Also, she has a very nice CC on her burst, which can group everyone up for Xiao to plunge up and down on top of. You're also going to need a healer. I suggest Barbara. She's the only other healer whose heals don't require you to stay in one spot. Also, her heals are just strong enough to counter Xiao's self-inflicted damage, and she can run the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers for the plus 48% attack boost. Finally, you have your flex pick. The reason there's a flex pick in the non-whale group is because there's not a very solid 4-star character that I'd say, like, use this character. They're that good with Xiao. There's a lot of great characters you can use with Xiao. Like, you can use Xingqiu, you can use Beidou, but none of them are, like, very solid like how Zhongli was for the whale group. Zhongli is just that good. You'd want to use Zhongli in every team if you have Zhongli. But if you're a non-whale and you don't have Zhongli at this point, then it doesn't really matter. Just choose the character who can break the desired shield. And that's pretty much it for Xiao. To me, he's not the best due to numerous constraints, but I've heard he's fun. Personally, I'm not really inclined to his playstyle. He feels kind of clunky to me, but if you like him, roll for him. If you like his aesthetics, roll for him. This game is, again, very single-player focused, and characters will be phased out. Right now, Ganyu is the best damage dealer in the entire game. But in 1 month, 2 months, she can get easily power creep. It's not something that's uncommon to gacha. So don't pull on him solely because he's not the best possible DPS unit, because if you're waiting for the best possible DPS unit, you're never going to roll. And that kind of defeats the point of a gacha game, unless you're playing it for the story, in which case it doesn't matter, you're not rolling anyways. So, not the best, not the worst. He does his role decently, and that should be good enough for a game like this. If you enjoyed the video or learned something from it, why not consider subscribing? It gives me motivation to keep going, and it also helps with the algorithm, or at least that's what I've heard. I do videos like this and other math things for Genshin Impact. That's pretty much all I do. If you have any ideas or math you want worked out, leave a comment down below and I might make a video on it. Yeah, thanks for watching.